thank you so much for coming out to hear about Hannah Bloomfield and her wonderful little treasure that she left for us. I'm looking forward to talking to you about it, and I've really enjoyed researching it, because as Katie mentioned, one of the collections that I take care of here are the cooking equipment tools. And a cookbook is a tool also, in addition to a documentary artifact, but so it helps inform how these tools work. So I really enjoyed getting to read through it and research it and find out all this stuff that I'm now going to share with you. So this is the title page of her little copybook. It's only about this big. And a couple years ago, Patrick Sherry, one of the other curators here, he's the curator of books, he showed it to me because he knew of my interest and what I take care of here. And I was just thrilled to see it. It's just a wonderful little book full of all kinds of information in addition to the recipes that are actually in it. So it's been in the collection since 1963. It was donated by Louise Kennard Haynes. And she's a DAR, and the patriot she's descended through, I don't think has a connection to Hannah Bloomfield. I think it came from her mother's side. I didn't spend a lot of time researching the donor, but I spent a lot of time researching her and her recipes. And it is currently on display down in the study gallery. So when you're done here, please stop into the study gallery. It's in cabinet 6, drawer 3, and it says cooking tools on the drawer. So it'll be in that one. So you do have a chance to actually go down and see that. So let's talk about Hannah. So this is Hannah Bloomfield. How fortunate that I was able to find a portrait of her. Beautiful woman, and this was painted when she was 21 years old. And I want to first thank the librarians for helping me research the Bloomfields, the Giles, all kinds of people connected with Hannah. They are really good researchers, our librarians. So I really appreciate their help. We know that Hannah was born on January 15th, 1764, because she wrote it in her copybook. So there was that, but it's also documented elsewhere. Her father was Moses Bloomfield, and they were from New Jersey, so they were a prominent family in New Jersey. Moses was a surgeon during the American Revolution, and he worked during the war, and he was an abolitionist. And it's likely that his family held the first abolitionist meeting in the United States in their home in New Jersey on July 4th, 1783. So as I said, he was a surgeon during the war. He was captured. His home was raided. They were really deeply involved in the war. And her mother, Sarah Ogden, was also from a prominent New Jersey family, the Ogdens. And Hannah was one of 7 children. And so she came from an affluent family. She learned to read and write. She saw activism in her own home, and her family, just all of her siblings had some kind of role either in the war or shortly after. So here she is. This is a painting by Joseph Wright. It's in a private collection, but actually through her husband's will, we know who exactly probably has it, because he willed it to his son, and you can see how it came down in the family. So as I said, her siblings were all pretty prominent. Some of them were pretty prominent too. Her brother was Joseph Bloomfield, who was also a general during the American Revolution, and he was a governor of New Jersey. So from 1801 to 1802, and then again from 1803 to 1812. He was 11 years older than her, and he was a lawyer in New Jersey. And here he is painted by Charles Willson Peale in 1777. But in 1782, he took an apprentice law student on, a certain General James Giles, pictured here, quite a handsome fellow. And so James also served in the Revolutionary War, and after studying for a year, he was licensed to practice law, and then he married Hannah. So, I guess we know how they met. So they married on May 23rd, 1784, and she was 17 when they married. They moved to New York City for a little while he practiced law, and here he is, also painted by Joseph Wright, also in 1785, so probably around the same time. So except for Hannah's cookbook, this is all we would know about her, that she married prominently, she came from a prominent family, and we would know her as Mrs. General James Giles. But because of her little cookbook, we can spend more time researching her and learning about her recipes and what she picked out. So this is another way to get to know Hannah and a woman of this time period. So after they married, they moved back to New York, I said, but then they moved, after a few years, they moved back to Bridgefield, New Jersey. And this is their house on 143 West Broad Street. It's still standing. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. It was built by Benjamin Keene, but I did not include the photo of the kitchen that they had because it was a very 1930s kitchen that really didn't look at all like what Hannah would have seen. But the Giles only had 3 children who reached adulthood, even though she gave birth 7 times. And her cookbook descended through her daughter who survived, Fanny. And so this is what we know about her from the public record, and now we can look at her copybook and see what else we can find out. But first, let's talk about what cookbook manuscripts are. So these are just handwritten cookbooks. Like, you probably have recipes that maybe you've written down or cut out from newspapers or something like that. You have a binder, you have a shoebox or something. These are different than printed cookbooks, published ones. But these recipes could have been copied from those printed cookbooks because not everybody had those printed cookbooks, so you would copy your favorite recipes out of it. So as far as cookbook manuscripts go, there are 2 different types, collected versus accretive. Collected ones are written by the authors. The recipes are actually written down by the author. And then there are accretive ones where they copied them out of other recipe books or newspapers or something like that. And Hannah's is probably a little bit of both, which is very common. And if you're interested in more on those types of cookbooks, I highly recommend Karen Hess's essay in Martha Washington's Book of Cookery, which I know many of you probably know a lot about. So what's exciting about cookbook manuscripts is that they really reflect the taste of the author. These were exactly what she liked. She was looking through recipes and she said, that one looks good, I'm going to write that one down. And to take the time to copy it down. Oh, that one looks good. Oh no, that one, that's not for me. So you can think about your own collections of recipes and what you prefer and what you disregard and say, oh no, I'm not even clipping that out. And that's kind of what these cookbook manuscripts are and what they represent. So they include, of course, recipes or receipts, remedies, household cleaning tips, all kinds of stuff like that. And according to a lot of food history researchers, these more closely approximate the foodways and the eating habits of people from our past than the printed ones do, because these represent what they actually found interesting and what they wanted to cook. Of course, we all have recipes we've clipped out of the newspaper that we have never made and probably never will. And I'm sure that these cookbooks included stuff like that too. But they're very personal because, when you look back through your recipes, you say, oh yeah, that's when I was into sun-dried tomatoes or something like that, And so, as I mentioned, printed cookbooks were also available at the time. And these are 2 of the most common ones that were available, but not everybody could afford to have these. Hannah probably could because she came from a pretty affluent family. So the first one, right here, this one is The Frugal Housewife or Complete Woman Cook by Susanna Carter. It was first printed in London in 1765 and then in Boston in 1772. And then, of course, Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy, first printed in London in 1745 and then a few more times and again in 1805 and a few times in America too. So Susanna's came first. Hannah actually copied a bunch of Susanna's recipes, and Hannah Glass copied a bunch of Susanna's recipes, and Hannah Bloomfield copied a bunch of Susanna's recipes. Word for word, verbatim, Hannah's cookbook manuscript includes a ton of Susanna Carter's recipes. So that's kind of exciting. I like to see where she got her inspiration. But then there's also a lot of recipes that I have no idea where they came from. So these books were kind of rare in homes, as I mentioned, and a lot of the other recipes that copybook writers would include would be some that they were familiar with in their own home, that they were used to having prepared for them, and so they wrote down exactly how it was done. And so those were more from memory or tradition or routine household meal preparation. So those are the printed ones. And now let's talk more about Hannah's in particular. This is the title page, and her cookbook contains a table of contents, which was fantastic to find because she listed them all out alphabetically. It was great. And there are 89 recipes in the book. There are a few pages missing at the end of the book, and I think it was written probably about 1780 to 1782 when she would have been in her teens, because she's still calling herself Miss Hannah Bloomfield, so she's not married yet, and she got married in 1783. And she wouldn't have been writing it too early, so I'm guessing about 1780, and that would make sense with some of the recipes that she copied from Susanna Carter's book. So as I said, she included a table of contents. This was great, because then I could just see how she wrote some of the titles to the recipes versus how she wrote them in the actual book. But as I mentioned, some of the pages are missing, but the table of contents includes them, so we know what was on the pages that were missing. Like 12 gallons of beer, she has a recipe for that. Listed in the table of contents, but it's not in the actual book. But we know she had it in there. And she left space, you can see throughout, to add more recipes, although I don't think she ever did. Even though more recipes were added to the book, I don't think she added more because they all kind of look like they were written at the same time. And so, of the 89 recipes, 66 are in the table of contents, so that's about 75%. So she added about a quarter more throughout, I don't know, her lifetime. I don't know if she continued to add them afterwards. I still have a lot of questions about the book. It answers a lot, but leads to a lot more. So Hannah's penmanship, as I said, she was from an affluent family, so she was able to learn to read and write, and she likely received instruction, and these copybooks were a way to test out her writing skills, sort of like samplers with young women and learning how their sewing skills. So females were given specific instruction on penmanship that was different than young men. And they learned a certain script style, and they learned ornamentation too. So she has her little flourishes up here in her first letters, and she makes all these little doodads in them that females learned differently than men did. And as you can see, her script is quite legible. Once you get used to reading it, then you can read them easily. And so this was a nice way to practice her handwriting and prepare herself for marriage. So she would have this little booklet full of recipes she gathered as a way to help start her household. So, of course, one of the questions I have, did somebody else write in this book? And I think someone did. I'm not an expert at penmanship by any means, but if you look at these two recipes, they're on corresponding sides of the booklet, you can see they look pretty different. So I know that there was at least one other hand, although I think there were maybe two others. And it makes perfect sense if this little booklet's out there and it's getting passed down maybe to her daughter, and her daughter has some ideas she wants to include, she would put that in there. So I did try to keep track of all this. I wanted to have a way to analyze all of this data. So I created an Excel spreadsheet. Fascinating, right? But it did let me organize it. I included the basic title of the recipe here, and then her official name of it, so I could sort by apple things or orange things or whatever, and then the page number, and then the hand, whether I thought it was Hannah's writing or someone else, which I just gave other 3, 03, 02, 01, something like that. And then whether or not it was in the table of contents, because I thought that was important. It's what she started out with. And then notes. I do have like missing pages, missing or whatever in that. And when I compared it to Hannah Glass versus Susanna Carter, and then I had some more notes too, if it was kind of similar but not exactly like those recipes. So everything I compared it to, I tried to include in my spreadsheet. Finally, a fun spreadsheet, right? It's about food. Okay, so what I learned is that Hannah really loved dessert. And I have no beef with that at all. So many of these things were desserts. 62% of her recipes were desserts. And according to a historic foodways scholar, Stephen Schmidt, desserts were harder to make, and that does make sense when you think about it. You needed instruction on them, you needed exact measurements, you needed times and more structure than for roasting beef. So think about your own cooking. Like sometimes you just roast a chicken, right? You don't need a recipe for it. You just cook it till it's 165 and then you're done. You know, maybe you put some butter, some garlic on it. But if you're gonna make cupcakes or brownies, you kind of need to know how much baking soda or powder or whatever. So that does make sense. And also throughout the 18th century, the price of sugar fell. So desserts, bring them on. Even printed cookbooks are skewed toward desserts too. There's a lot of desserts in them. But she did include some other ones. So the second most common were preserves here, and she had 13% were preserves, and then what I'm calling our main dishes, which are like roasted beef, alamoting beef, that sort of thing, which they probably called made dishes. That was 11%. And then sauces, lots of sauces, 9%. Beverages were 5%, and medicinal recipes were 5%, and then some household ones, recipes were just 1% of them, so not very many. She wasn't that interested in household stuff. So, of her desserts, what I really learned was that she really liked pudding. I'm pressing the wrong thing. There we go. She really liked pudding. Really liked pudding. And this isn't even all of them. She had Eve's pudding, apple pudding, orange pudding, yam pudding, Richmond pudding, Duke of Buckingham pudding, almond pudding, and more. You know, there's a lot of pudding in here. I can't complain. I mean, I like pudding. And so of the puddings, am I on still? No, I gotta go to the next one. Okay, of the pudding, or of the desserts, a full 47% are of pudding. 7 are baked in a paste, so basically they're a pie. 9 are boiled, 6 are baked on their own. And all of these pudding recipes are for sweet puddings, not savory puddings. So, she liked pudding. And then the next most common was cake. And these are things she might not call them, you know, a cake, but once you read the recipe, you know that it is a cake. They're not called that here, but that's basically what they are. And then the next one were cookies, which of course she didn't call them cookies either, like rusks or jumbles, those kinds of things, small cakes. We know those to be puddings. I got pudding on the brain. We know those to be cookies. And then the final one is other, and that's stuff like floating islands that don't really fit into the other categories. It's like a meringue. So, puddings. But we know that another thing we can learn from her cookbook, if we didn't already know that Hannah was American, her recipes show us that she was definitely American. One of her recipes is for yam pudding. And by yam, she meant sweet potato, because there was already confusion about that tuber, that root vegetable back then. So there's yam pudding, there's a cure for a felon. Now this isn't a recipe to, you know, reform thieves and that sort of thing. This is, a felon is, and I had to look this up, an infection around your finger I think it's in the quick around your finger, you get an infection there. And so in this recipe, that includes goose dung and ground glass. It also includes Indian meal, which is cornmeal, and that would have been only available in the Americas at this time. So I don't know how effective that would be in curing an infection, adding goose dung. Ground glass, I just don't think that's ever a good idea for anything in your body. And then another recipe that she includes is Washington cake, and this one is probably a later addition to the cookbook. And so obviously this one would indicate that it's an American cookbook, even if we didn't know that she was. I also found this recipe in a manuscript cookbook in the Maryland Historical Society written by Hannah Williams. They all have to be Hannah, apparently. And her book is from 1819. I haven't seen the recipe, so I don't know if it's the same as this Washington cake. And there's nothing exciting about this Washington cake. It's flour, sugar, butter. There's nothing exciting about it. So what else did she include in the book? Drinks. Hannah liked her drinks too. So the 4 recipes for beverages in the book, they are all alcoholic. And this isn't uncommon, this isn't unusual. She wasn't, you know, a lush, you know, out there in New Jersey stumbling around. As I mentioned, one recipe was for 12 gallons of beer. Hey, if you're gonna make beer, you know, you're gonna need a good, and she was probably entertaining, so she probably needed, and why would you make a small batch, right? So it's in the table of contents. And it's not surprising at all to have beer, as one other well-known cookbook author of the time wrote, Mrs. Child, in the American Frugal Housewife, beer is a good family drink. Well, I couldn't agree more. And another one that she included was quince liqueur. I wanted to try making this, but I couldn't find quince, and I also couldn't find a pound of coriander seeds. A pound. Oh, she had to mean volume, because, I mean, I have a bag at home of coriander seeds. It's about this big, and it's only 7 ounces. How big would, and the liquor, or the alcohol in this was only about a gallon. There would be more volume of coriander seeds than brandy. So I didn't try that one. Maybe sometime, though. And then a syllabub. She included a recipe for a syllabub, which is a very common drink in the 18th century. It's made with white wine, sometimes ale, and it's fortified with a heavy cream to make it nice and frothy. And it's been made for centuries. The first recipe, the earliest recipe I can find is from 1537. So it's been around for a long time, a very common drink. And then she also had a recipe for lemon brandy. So we'll put a pin in that, and we're going to come back to that, because there's more on the lemon brandy to come. All right, so she had drink recipes, she had American recipes, she had some interesting ones. This was an interesting recipe for a few reasons. It's to pickle red cabbage, and it calls for cochineal. She adds cochineal to the recipe for coloring her cabbage red. Many of you probably know what cochineal is. It's a beetle from the American Southwest, Mexico, parts of South America, and usually we read about it in dyeing cloth. And in modern times, currently, it's used commercially to naturally dye beverages and some other food things. But my question is, why didn't she just use red cabbage? It was very available at the time. Other receipt books call for red cabbage, so I don't know why she didn't just want to use red cabbage. So that's one of those mysteries that I hope to uncover at some point. And maybe it'll turn up in another recipe. Maybe she just had, regular green cabbage and wanted it really red. And she does just call for cabbage. She doesn't say red, but maybe she just wanted it more red than purple. Okay, and something else I learned about Hannah Bloomfield Giles. She didn't really like fish. Does anybody here like fish? Not like fish. Does anybody here not like fish? Oh, okay, I do too. I like fish. But I've met people who are really opposed to fish, any kind of fish. And so maybe Hannah was the same way. I mean, we know that fish was very available at the time, especially in New Jersey. Printed cookbooks contained tons of recipes for fish, but she had not one single recipe for fish in her whole book. So I'm going to gather that she just didn't like fish. That's fine. So one of the things I like to do is try out 18th century receipts and cooking and techniques and all that kind of stuff. And I know there are people here also who do and face similar challenges when trying to read the recipe and say, what do they mean? And after you've cooked a lot of recipes, you can kind of start to judge like, oh, that probably means this or that. It's not as straightforward as just simply following the instructions. Ingredients can be hard to find, if not impossible. How do we even know that our flour tastes the same as it did back then? There weren't the fertilizers, the soil has changed, hybridization has changed things. Do we even know that a carrot today tastes just like a carrot did? Is it as sweet? Is it less sweet? There's so many things that could change this without even our awareness of what they might be. Measurements were not standardized, so she calls for a teacup full of wine. Well, you've seen plenty of teacups, right? And they're all varied in size. And which kind of wine? The pound of coriander seeds, that really threw me for a loop. But so there's a lot of guessing, a lot of intelligent guessing from experience and what you've learned. Our stovetops and our ovens cook differently than the stovetops and ovens from the past and hearths. And one of the things that's hard to get past is we try to make things palatable to our modern tastes and textures. We like certain textures. We don't like some weird chunky kind of things. And some of the recipes, that's what they produce. So we try to make them palatable to us now, and our palates might be different, are definitely different than they were back then. We cringe at some of the recipes that were so very common back then. Calf's foot jelly, which is what it sounds like, calf's head pudding, brain balls. I'm not making this up, I wouldn't do that. I can't even attempt to even consider trying a recipe called brain balls, no. So there's a lot of interpretation and adaptation on our parts. And so what we come up with is always going to be very subjective. But we still want to try, because we still want to see what these things taste like, and we still want to try to get as close as we can to the people from the past. Just checking the time. And so I did try a few of the recipes from Hannah's book. So the first thing I tried were queen cakes. Now this is a very common baked dish from the 18th century, 17th century, and into the 19th century. These were just little little cakes that are highly seasoned and flavored and go well with tea. They would be baked into different kinds of shapes, stars, hearts. There were tins made especially for baking them. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because I did write a blog post on this, and if anybody's interested afterwards, just let me know and I'll direct you to it. But they were very common, and so that was an easy one to start with. I thought, I'll just give that one a try because that one I know. So the next one I tried were her waffles. I really had this great idea that I thought I wanted to use my pizzelle maker to make waffles because I didn't want to build a fire and then put an 18th century waffle iron in it and do that. I just didn't. So I thought, the pizzelle maker would do kind of the same thing, and it has the same shape. So I used that. And her recipe was a little misleading because, now we know Hannah probably wasn't making these recipes. She had servants who were making these things. And she got a little excited and she called for 2 quarts of milk, 1 pound of butter, 12 eggs, a teacupful of good yeast. That's a lot of yeast. Half a gill of brandy, a little ginger, half a gill of rose water, and serve them up with pulverized cinnamon, sugar, and butter. But no flour. And waffles need flour. And I just to be sure, I consulted as many recipes as I could. And you know, there's a lot of recipes in printed cookbooks out there for waffles, and they all have flour. I just wanted to be sure. So I made hers, but I added flour. And you know, they didn't turn out too badly immediately after I made them. But they didn't last. They didn't hold up well. I brought them into work and everybody was very kind, but they were a little chewy. I even tried toasting them in the oven again, but that lasted for just a few minutes. They were a little rubbery. But hey, I tried. And I brought in snacks. So now, as promised, I tried lemon brandy. I tried the lemon brandy recipe. Now this was fun because it's alcohol. So, so I thought, what could go wrong there? So this recipe, she says, take the rinds of 18 sour lemons, pared off very thin, so scraped very thin, the peel off of them. I just used the vegetable peeler. It worked wonderfully. And then I put it to a gallon of good brandy for 3 or 4 days. Then you fish the lemon peel out, and you add a rich syrup, she says. A rich syrup, and then you put in a pint of, she calls it fresh cream from a cow. Well, I don't have access to a cow, so I used heavy cream. And I'm pretty sure that worked just fine. Then I let that stand for another 2 days, and then she says, you strain it in a jelly bag, which I thought was interesting. I thought that was a modern cooking tool, but she says she calls it a jelly bag, so I used mine. And because when you put heavy cream into something with lemons, it curdles. So here's the brandy, here's the lemons, the lemon peels. That's it curdled after I put the cream in, and I was like, oh, that doesn't look good. But I'm following the recipe, I'm trying it, I'm doing it. This is the brandy with the peels in it soaking, and this is the finished product. After I strained it, the curdled things came out, and it needs to be shaken because it will separate, but it was actually really good. It was actually very good, so maybe later there might be some samples. So I couldn't find this recipe. I could find recipes for lemon brandy in a bunch of other sources, 1859, 1876, and 1888, but none of them were even remotely similar to Hannah's. However, an exciting prospect did come up, and I'm very excited about this. I will try to contain myself. There exists a manuscript in a historical society in Maryland, in a Maryland Archives Historical Society, that was written by Hannah's daughter, Fanny, and it includes a recipe for lemon brandy. So I'm very excited to go to the Historical Society and have a look at it and compare it. I found this on an online database that a food history researcher created, and I'm so excited to go and look at this, and I plan to compare that recipe, but I plan to compare all of her recipes to see if Fanny copied out of this book into her own book. Oh, so many possibilities exist. I'm very excited about this. We're looking at a few more columns in my spreadsheet, I'm pretty sure. So that's the last recipe I tried. So Hannah died in December of 1823. She was 59, almost 60. She would have been 60 the following month. Her husband died only a few years later. And, as I mentioned, it's unlikely that she did any of this cooking. She had servants doing it, but she was directing this household. She would have had her cookbook ready, and she would have had her knowledge of what she liked ready, and it would have helped give her a start with her favorite dishes and what she wanted coming out of the kitchen in her own household. As I said, Hannah would have remained Mrs. General Giles, and this is a way to get a little bit closer to her. And in fact, all historical figures, you never are going to know them personally or intimately at all. We can't ever know, what motivated them to do something, or their situations. But these kind of sources like diaries and journals and letters and cookbook manuscripts help us get a little bit closer, understand a little bit more about her. Hannah didn't like fish. Hannah liked pudding. I like knowing those kind of things about her. So she would have really remained pretty anonymous if not for this little book. And I think that there are many of these little books and many of these little sources out there that can tell us a lot more about women who otherwise are just waiting to be discovered. So, and it's food and cooking, so these things are all relegated to women's work, and that's fine. Those are women's spheres because that was the sphere in which they lived, so this was a part of her world. So if this is the way we have to understand her, then fine, because that was her world. And I really appreciated getting to go through this book to get a glimpse of her personality and her little world. So one more picture. Is this the end? No, it's not, because I'm going to continue to make recipes. There's to a la mode beef. We think of pie a la mode, but she's using it as a verb, a la mode, one word. I want to try that. It's rolled up meat. It's like roulade, I want to try that. And I'm definitely going to see this cookbook at the Historical Society and compare recipes. So this is always going to be something that I'll continue to work on and see what I can find out about. So one more image of Hannah. This is a Saint Memon of her in 1799. She was 35. And so keep this in mind because we're going to try, if you're interested, some of her recipes. I made the queen cakes and the lemon brandy, and I hope if you're interested, you're welcome to come and have a sample. And I'll go over here and if you have questions, you can ask while I'm over there. That way I don't keep too much of your time. And don't forget to look at her book down in the study gallery.